Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for joining us on this snowy, sleety, winter stormy day. We are delighted to have you with us for today's Lunch and Learn, Learning to Act on Environmental Justice, how Smithsonian Science for Global Goals cultivates sustainability mindsets. What is environmental justice and how can young people be active participants in creating a more environmentally just future? Smithsonian Curriculum Director Heidi Gibson is with us today to introduce the Smithsonian Science for Global Goals project and share a brand new guide to help youth ages 8 to 17 explore environmental justice as they develop the skills, knowledge, and attitudes needed to create a more sustainable future. We're so happy to have you with us today, Heidi.
It's such a pleasure to be here.
My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 10,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speaker first and then tackle our questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send them to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them to ask Heidi at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and we will share the video with you later this afternoon in a follow-up email, as well as post it on our website where you can find recordings of all of our previous programs. Thank you again for joining us. And Heidi, I will turn things over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you today. I've shared my screen and I'm here today to talk to you, as Kathleen said, about the Smithsonian Science for Global Goals project, which is a big project that's part of the Smithsonian, and more specifically, our guide on environmental justice, which is actually super new. It's actually coming out on Monday. It will be formally published. So you all are the first people we're sharing it with. So congratulations, you're the pioneers. And we're gonna get started. Hold on, let me see if this is working. So during my presentation, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction of what this thing, this Smithsonian Science for Global Goals project is. We're going to look a little bit at the Environmental Justice Guide, what's in it, and then we'll just do a few activities and discuss a few activities to let you get a little taste of what's involved. So first of all, I am from the Smithsonian, and probably many of you are familiar with the Smithsonian. You may have been to our fantastic museums in Washington, D.C., but I am inspired every day by the Smithsonian's purpose. And it's so simple. It's the increase and diffusion of knowledge. And I just love that as a way of centering what it is that the Smithsonian does, because I didn't realize before I joined the Smithsonian just how broad our reach is. Not only do we have the largest museum, education, and research complex in the world, we've got 19 museums, we've got research centers. I didn't know that. We have one on, the Eastern Shore, we have one at Panama. Education centers, the National Zoo is part of the Smithsonian, and 154 million objects. So we have a broad reach. And with that, in that, I'm part of the Smithsonian Science Education Center. And we are a center that was founded first in 1985. And at the time, it was a joint project between the Smithsonian and the National Academies of Science and Medicine Engineering together. And then in 2010, we came fully under the Smithsonian umbrella, but we continue to have a really close relationship with the National Academies, not only within the United States, but all over the world, but through what's called the Inter-Academy Partnership. And this work that I'm talking about today is actually supported through the Inter-Academy Partnership. So we are the only organization within the Smithsonian, and we focus specifically on formal K-12 STEM education. We also work in informal spaces. And our mission is to transform K-12 education through science and in collaboration with communities across the globe. So what that means is, rather than come in and say, we have the answers and you implement them, we are really dedicated to this idea that together we can collaborate to sort of create a new situation for education and science education in particular. So through that, we have sort of 3 areas we talk about: innovation, sort of a different way of approaching science in classrooms. Inclusion, we think it's really important that we include everybody in the science conversation, cultivate diverse STEM professionals. And this last one is sustainability. So advancing K-12 education for sustainable development. And that is in particular what we're trying to work on through this Smithsonian Science for Global Goals project. So this project started in 2016, and many of you may be familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which came out in 2015, and they sort of set what I call the World Strategic Plan between 2015 and 2030. And this project is really inspired by trying to guide young people to grapple with these massive issues talked about from the UN Sustainable Development Goals, using scientific understandings, using social science research, and using their community as a classroom. So really understanding all of the sort of bits and pieces, that perspectives that go into trying to find sustainable solutions for these big problems like good health and well-being and zero hunger and clean water. So we're really trying to address sort of the biggest challenges of our age with young people. And throughout the guide, we have what we call a discover, understand sort of framework or arc. Young people start with what they know. They carry out investigations in their local spaces, and then we have this huge emphasis on action and action taking. And I'll talk about more of that in just a second. But first, I just wanted to share with you the guides that we already have. So you'll see here we have one on mosquito-borne diseases. We have one on food and nutrition. We have one on sustainable communities. That was our most recently published guide. It includes a lot of housing and transportation, sustainable use of space. We have one on vaccines that specifically guides young people to sort of explore the science behind vaccines, as well as consider sort of community concerns about vaccines. And one that came out in May 2020 on COVID-19. So it was a sort of very rapid response to that evolving situation. And then, as I said, we're about to publish our guide on environmental justice on Monday. And later in February, we will be publishing a guide on biodiversity. So a lot of really fun materials for young people and for educators to use. And so I just want to guide you very briefly through what it is we sort of asking young people to do in this guide, because it's quite different to a sort of call and response type of education system where somebody sits down and says, you need to learn these 5 things and students respond. Instead, we're really thinking of what does it take to put young people in the driver's seat, to make them in charge, not only of their own learning, but of the actions they want to take. And we think that it starts, if you look in this figure, you'll see the yellow figure in the middle starts with cultural context, learning dispositions, and background knowledge. That's sort of a way of describing the resources that young people come to this work with. So rather than saying, people show up as a blank slate, we know that they have a specific cultural context. We know that they have a best way to learn, and we know that they have a lot of knowledge. And that's not only knowledge about sort of the science, it's also knowledge about their communities. And I would say that's probably true for everyone on this call as well. We all tend to be kind of experts in our own spaces. And so to start off by acknowledging that expertise, I think really sets the stage for giving people the agency to take action. So then there's sort of a guided process where young people start with questions they have about the topic. In this case, environmental justice, maybe what does it mean? They do some investigations in their own community, trying to unpack what they find in their own local space. And that can be hyper local, their school, their neighborhood, it can be their town, it can be their state, it could be their country, depending on what they decide. And then they try and make sense of what they found. So what does that mean sort of by itself, critical reasoning, but also what does it mean within the larger system? Because these topics we're talking about are so complex, they really have to be embedded within a larger system in order to be sort of addressed. And then we have young people who are usually working in teams synthesize. So we make the decision-making separate than the sense-making. When they're doing systemic understanding and critical reasoning, that's when they're trying to understand what it means. When they're synthesizing, they're trying to assign value. Okay, what is it that we want to do? What's most important? What can be prioritized and what shouldn't be prioritized? And trying to come to consensus and build skills of collaboration. And then we guide them to take action. And those are self-determined student actions. So that's sort of the process we go through. And in that process, they're building something called scientific literacy, which is basically how you use science to inform decision-making and choices you make, but also what we call the sustainability mindsets. And I really love this because it helps us center what it is we're hoping students get out of this work. And the first and foremost, we're really hoping that what they leave with is a belief that what they do, their personal action, can lead to positive change. We're next thinking, okay, they need to be open-minded and reflect that none of these works or none of the solutions that we can find that would be sustainable is one person's first opinion, that we need to not only reflect on our own opinions and sort of iterate on our ideas, but also we need to bring in the ideas of others and try and understand those different perspectives. We believe that it's really important to center equity and justice in this work, not only in terms of respect for yourself and other humans, but also other living things and the environment in general, and trying to weigh up some of those ethical issues. And then the last thing we think is really important is that young people walk away with the idea that what happens in their local space connects globally. And we kind of think of it like this, like we have these big global issues, we kind of look at them in the microcosm of our own local space through investigations. We make local investigations, we take local decisions, students take local actions, but then they start to think, okay, how do these local actions have a global impact? So they're sort of connected on both sides, but in the middle, they're finding things that are most relevant to them through their own local spaces and areas. So that's Smithsonian Science for Global Goals sort of in general. But today I want to specifically talk about environmental justice and why I think talking to young people about environmental justice is important. And the first thing I think is that young people need to be involved in all conversations about sustainability, not only because we want them to start from a very early age to start thinking about, what is sustainability and what's my role in it, and to be curious about it, to have the interest and sort of belief that they can change their local and global communities, but also because young people have the most to lose from an unsustainable planet. On average, they'll be on this planet the longest. So I think it's really important they're involved in these conversations. And I'm sure that we've all noticed that youth are already showing us how they want to make their local and global communities more sustainable. We've seen a tremendous upsurge in young people protesting and getting involved and really trying to have their opinions known. And this work is really inspired by some of that activism. And why environmental justice? Because I think sustainability and justice cannot be separated. Sustainability balances what we call the four perspectives. We think about environmental perspective, the environmental side of things, the social perspective, so how humans interact, education, healthcare, all of that. The economic perspective, how people make a living, how they have enough money to do the things they need to do in order to live. And then that ethical perspective, what's good and what's right. And if you're trying to balance all of those things, there is no way to do it if there is a major injustice occurring. It's inherently unsustainable. And that's why it's so important. All injustices are unsustainable, but particularly environmental justice because of this environmental side of things. And so that is why environmental justice, we think, is such an important conversation to have with young people, and centering this idea that everyone deserves to live in a healthy environment. And what do we need to do to create that situation? So from the beginning of the guide, young people, we call them action researchers. They're sort of they're leading the work. So the guide is aimed at students, and they start by thinking about who they are and what their relationship is with the environment. They move on to sort of think about what environmental justice actually is, how it affects their health and well-being and the health and well-being of others. And then they start really thinking about the environmental justice problems in their own community and doing investigations on those. They think about the causes, they think about the impacts and how those impacts are often unjust. And then they start moving on to what can be done, what has been done, and they end with thinking about how we will act. So that's a sort of broad arc of what happens in this guide, but I'm going to talk to you about some of the specific activities a little bit. And I'd invite you with this next bit, if you have a piece of paper handy, or if you just want to think, this is sort of a do it at home portion of the webinar. So we have students always in our guides start with their own identities. And that is really important. One, because it puts them in a space of respect, that they've already come in and said, here's what I know, here's my experience, here are the things that are important to me. It also puts them in a space where they can respect others and understand others' perspectives. And it lets them understand what they maybe don't know and need to learn. So we have students complete what's called an identity map. I'm sharing mine with you today. And I there are lots of different categories that could be on the map, but just a few things about mine. I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, which is where I am now, but in between I went and lived all over the world. I've had a career that includes both sort of civic education, science education, and international relations. And I am a person with lots of people in my life. I have 6 siblings, many relatives, and that informs how I move through the world. I have 2 kids, and that definitely informs how I move through the world and how I think about what happens next. So those are some of sort of my perspectives and what the perspectives I bring to this work. And I'd love to invite all of you, if you have time and inclination, to take a moment, write your name on a page, put a circle around it, and I'll allow you to build an identity map. And if you don't have a piece of paper, that's fine. Just think to yourself, what would I put? What are the things about my identity that most define me? We give students these guides. We think, okay, is it your age, your school, your class, your race, your ethnicity? Some of those are often big identifiers, but also, gender, the country you live in, the country or place that's important to your family, beliefs that are important to you, topics that interest you, hobbies, physical traits, personality traits, roles you have. So there's not one thing that defines your identity. And I think that's really important for young people to kind of see that we're all sort of a multifaceted group of identities that come together. And it also allows you to connect with other people throughout our guides, we actually use scientists and researchers, experts, activists, and we have them in some of our guides share their identity map, and you can start to see, oh, this person really likes anime, and so do I. Or this person really loves to ride their bike, and so do I. So you start to see people as more than just a role that they have, that they are made up of many perspectives. Now, I asked Kathleen if she wanted to do her identity map, and if she has done it, I'd love for her to share, some of the things that make her perspectives her perspectives.
Thank you, Heidi. And I want to thank you too for sharing your map, because of course, I don't know if anybody else has this experience, but I think, well, gosh, who am I? I don't know how to define all of those pieces. So thank you. And one of the things I think is pieces of my identity that's super relevant to this conversation is that my first career was as an elementary school teacher. So I taught 5th grade in public and private schools for many years. And I think a lot about the conversations that I had with students who are now all grown up somewhere out there. And then also about the experience of my own kids. I have 2 kids in public school here in Maine, and think about their experience and what they're wrestling with, and how I can get this guide into the hands of their teachers.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I think it's just so important to stop and think about who we are and the perspectives that we have, and how that can both help us and sometimes hinder us. I often think when I approach this guide, my lived experience with environmental injustice is limited. And so I really had to work to center the voices of other people who have had more personal experience as I did the guide. And I think that that's an important thing for us all to reflect on, is what are the perspectives we bring, and where can we bring in the perspectives of others? When do we lead and when do we follow, basically? And so after students do that work, and they also spend some time thinking about not only who they are, but who they are in relationship with the environment around them. They go outside, they listen, they look, they taste the air, to try and start establishing who it is they want to be. They think about what it means to be a steward of the environment. They then start to think, well, what are we thinking about with environmental justice? And rather than giving them a definition and saying, okay, here's what environmental justice is, go, we took the approach that we want students to make this meaning for themselves, because that by making the meaning, it makes sense of things, and it promotes agency, that it's reflective of their own opinions and concerns, and it's localized. So environmental justice in one place might have sort of different things that are really resonating than environmental justice another place. We wanted to create space for that students could make it feel local to them and relevant to them. So the first thing we have them do is think about justice, because that's even a trickier concept than the environment, right? What is justice? And we have them start by creating, adding words to a map, and then we give them some situations to consider, not as a right or wrong, but just as ways of trying to make their thinking a little bit more explicit. So I'm going to share some of the situations with you today. And these situations are all based on real world situations that are happening around our country and around our world. So our first situation is a large online retailer is building many warehouses. It's a pandemic. Many warehouses. Vehicles go to and from these warehouses frequently, and it pollutes the surrounding air. Studies show these warehouses are more likely to be built in neighborhoods where many people of color live. Now, if you were a classroom, if you were a group of students, what I'd have you think is, on a line from unjust to just, where would I place that situation? Is it all the way just? Is it all the way unjust? Or is it somewhere in between? And the goal behind this is not to have students come up with one answer, but to have them think about why. And if it's unjust, who is it unjust to? And how can it, how could it be addressed? Because students might say, hey, I buy things online all the time. We need those warehouses. What could change to make that situation more just if they felt that it was unjust that all those warehouses were in one neighborhood? Where would they go? So just starting to think about that. So I invite you to place yourself mentally on the line, and we'll do another one. Okay, it's also based on a true situation. A group of people has been gathering and eating plants from marshes around their home for hundreds of years. This group of indigenous people. Gathering and eating these plants is an important part of their culture. Recently, other people drained the water from the marshes and have used the water for other purposes. The plants no longer grow in the drained marshes. Is it just? Is it unjust? And what would make it more just or unjust? Think about does it make a difference what they use the water for? Or does it make a difference who owns the land? And what do we mean by land ownership? So just starting to kind of confront some of these kind of tricky issues. I'm going to do one more. And this is also based on a situation. And this is about sort of an environmental justice approach. So in one region, there's a new law, and it requires a special review of the environmental and public health impacts when building things such as sewage treatment plants, landfills, power plants in communities that have large, low-income or minority populations. So I would imagine that some students would say, absolutely, we should do that. And some students might say, well, shouldn't we be doing that for everyone, not just large, low income or minority populations? So starting to think about what justice means and who is it just for? Does it make a difference if these populations have had already a huge environmental burden? Would then it be more just to look at it in that way? Okay. Oh, I will do this last one with you because I think it's awfully fun. This is also based on a country. And this country granted its waterways the same legal status and protections as humans. So anyone harming the waterways can be taken to court and charged as if they had harmed a human. Is that just? And it makes you start to think, well, what are the rights of a waterway? First of all, what are the rights of humans? What are the rights of living things? And what are the rights of sort of other parts of the environment and of nature? And after students have done some of this sort of reflective work, we have them kind of bring it together almost like a Venn diagram, not exactly, but to start to think, okay, this is what the environment is. And this is what we've thought about what justice is, what justice means. How do those two things overlap? What are the points of intersection? And what would our definition be of environmental justice? And I love the fact that this guide is not about environmental injustice, although it has many examples of environmental injustices. It's about what an environmental just future looks like. So really trying to cast it in a positive way. What would justice look like for an environmental way, environmental justice? After students make those meanings, they go on to trying to figure out what it means for them. And throughout the guides, as I mentioned, we use both scientific and social scientific investigations for students. So one of the first things they do is think about health in their community. And then when they get to this portion, they start to think about, well, what are the environmental experiences in my own community? And this really allows them to start with their own experiences. What are my experiences with my environment, with weather in my environment, with things that have gone wrong, with things that are good. And they can do interviews, they can look at maps, they can look online. There's a lot of different tools presented to let them really see and unpack what the environmental problems of their own area are. And then they do some more data collection. So this is where we get a little bit more sciencey. but really starting to think about investigating water quality. They do that a little bit, and then they also have some online tools that they can use since they're limited in some of the things they can test. Think about things like noise pollution, particulate matter, extreme heat, extreme weather. And the idea is not that students will do all of these investigations. It's that they will pick the investigations that are most relevant to them. The reason the noise pollution investigation is in there is as we were developing the guides, we talked to some groups of young people who said, that is a big problem in my community, that it's hard for me to sleep or to study or to even be in class because it is so loud. And so fantastic. And there are communities where I don't think noise pollution is a huge issue. So really trying to create that space to be locally customized to really respond to the issues that students are seeing so that they can investigate those a little bit more thoroughly. And then they move on to thinking about why these things exist. And we have them kind of work backwards. So they've maybe found a health problem. And earlier in the guide, they do some investigations about that connection between health problems and the environment. Let's say asthma. So say there's a large prevalence of asthma in their community that they found out through their sort of health statistics investigations earlier. They might have figured out, oh, okay, that's because there's actually the air of my community is really dirty. There's a lot of particulate matter. But then we have them go further. Okay, well, so what is causing this particulate matter? So we start to think, okay, well, maybe there's big highways going through the community, or maybe there's a big bus depot, or maybe there's a factory that has things coming out of it that are polluting the air. So starting to kind of pull that out, and they're putting the results of the investigations they found. But then we want to go one step further, which is to start to think about sort of the systems that are allowing those causes to exist, the systemic causes. And we go back to the perspectives that we talked about a little bit more about sustainability. So thinking about systems from sort of those perspectives. So for instance, economic systems, thinking about, okay, well, what types of jobs do people have in my area? Do people have enough money? Is there a lot of economic inequality? Are there restrictions on businesses or different regulations? And those are all really important questions to start to understand the systems that allow these things to exist. But also those social systems, what are some of the inequalities socially? Who's making decisions and who is not making decisions? That has a huge amount to do with environmental justice issues, who's involved in shaping some of the decisions. What kind of a role does government play? Thinking about the environment. A lot of the environmental justice issues we're seeing are also issues of climate justice. How does the changing climate impact environmental justice? Or what are some of the global pollutions and how does that relate to what I'm seeing in my local community? And then always coming back to this idea of ethics. So what's fair? Are some people treated differently because of a characteristic about them, like the color of their skin or their gender, their sexuality, age, income level, disability? All of those things can be related to the way people experience the environment and whether or not they're able to live in a healthy place. So trying to help young people really think about some of those systems that they exist in and think about what could change, or where they want to sort of spend their energy in finding change. And we move finally into that point, which is we've kind of understood the problem, we've investigated the problem, we've unpacked the causes, and now the question is, what do we do about it? We start by having them think like, okay, so who's in my community and what are the injustices I'm seeing in my community? Throughout the guide, they have something called a justice reflection sheet, where there's questions to kind of come back to think about, are there injustices I've noticed? Are there justices I've noticed? But then they really start to build out and make sure that they're not missing things. Who's in my community? Who's included? Who is not included? How do we make decisions? And from there, they use that the injustice sheet, the justice reflections. They also do a piece of collaborative artwork to really explore what injustice is in their own community. And they move forward to start thinking about solutions. So throughout the guide, we have quotes from experts and activists. At this point, we also introduced some environmental history. This is a timeline of the US environmental justice movement, just to try and help young people see themselves as an extension of work that's ongoing, and to see that these people are just people and that they can too take a role. And so this is a fantastic activist from the Philippines, and she's sharing things about how, that there are things that are being done, because there's this idea sometimes that the environmental problems we face are so overwhelming that we just want to shut down. We just want to kind of walk away from it. So really trying to make it into, this is the first step you can take. And after you take that step, maybe you take the next step, but trying to make it easy to start and less intimidating, I think, is an important part of these guides. And we also have some opportunities to think about new ideas. So innovations, there's some really, really fun science, technology, engineering, math innovations to try and address environmental issues. There's also policy innovations. And I'm sure Kathleen can think of a few in terms of different approaches that you can take to try and address some of these issues. And most importantly, having students think of their own ideas. What are the new ways of approaching these problems that they can think of? Then we have them explore the possibilities for action, form a plan, act, do the thing. So don't just plan it, do it. And then we finish up with reflection. And so that's just a quick sort of journey through the guides, but really should give you an idea of this approach of trying to give young people an active role in solving global problems in their own local spaces. When Kathleen and I were talking about this, she was saying, resources are so important, but there's also other things needed. So I wanted to very briefly talk about some of the other things that are happening at the Smithsonian Science Education Center. We also do, we support teachers through webinars. We're working on STEM education for sustainable development. So we have sort of supports for teachers that are interested in getting involved there. We also do a lot of leadership development. Every summer, our professional services team does what's called the Action Planning Institute, where they bring in school leaders and administrators from all over the country to try and plan out what happens next and how to sort of change their approach to science education. And just in the past year, we've started something called the Network for Emergent Socio-Scientific Thinking, which is bringing together educators and scientists and oh my goodness, all sorts of people, policymakers, to just sort of start to think about what this means and how can we support it in education. And so that's kind of a brief overview. If there's things here that have resonated with you and you're involved in education or you want to be involved in education, please do reach out. There's a email address at the bottom, and our goal is to help people. And so we are very pleased to do that. The guides are freely available for download. So you can explore our website, and thank you. And I'm excited to hear some questions.
Heidi, thank you so much. This is just so exciting. And so everybody knows, in the follow-up email this afternoon, we will definitely share the link to the Smithsonian Science Education Center, the link where you'll be able to find the Environmental Justice Guide just as soon as it comes out. And you will also be able to check out Heidi Gibson's new book, From Ideas to Action, Transforming Learning to Inspire Action on Critical Global Issues. It's a snowy day. You're not going out. You can download it as soon as you, as soon as the email hits your inbox, and spend the rest of the day with it. I also just want to make this, this connection to what's going on right here, right now in Maine, which many of you know about. We're working on a bill in the legislature, LD 1902, to support climate education in Maine. And boy, do we know exactly what that could look like, right? We've got a great list of resources. 1902 is one of the priorities of the Environmental Priorities Coalition, and we've got fact sheets on the MCV and MCA websites, and we're really just looking for, let me stop. The status of that bill right now, I'm remembering, it was voted out of committee this week with a party line vote, but overwhelming support, and will be taken up by the legislature the next time they're in session together. I'll give you the spoiler. The biggest hurdle for getting this enacted will be the fiscal note, to make sure that there is money to support the professional development and the climate education opportunities that we need. So you know you can count on us to keep you posted on when and how to weigh in. But let's stop talking about that and go back to the science education project. Heidi, we've got so many questions. I'm really excited to spend some time going through them, but you started with identity in the guide and today. So let's start with identity in the questions too. Tell us about how you ended up in this work. What draws you here?
Oh, that's such a good question. And like anyone my age, I think I've had my own journey. You know, started off as a biology major in college, and then actually ended up joining the Peace Corps for a while, joined the US Foreign Service as a foreign service officer, so lived overseas. And then I had my kids and I became a stay-at-home mom for a few years. And as I was in that space, as I took some time to really reflect, I started to think, what is it that I feel like really needs to happen? Like, what is it that I feel I can really bring to the world? And I think that that's a question we all ask ourselves. And I started to think, what I really think we need to do is to sort of understand a little bit more what these global issues are and how they impact us all. And those are, you know, environmental issues or social issues, they're all connected. And this idea of, I think that we basically our only chance for a sustainable future is through sort of a global collaborative effort. And so that is what, you know, I really wanted to do. I went back, I got a degree in international education. I was a fellow at the Smithsonian and did the work for the book that Kathleen just shared, which was a lot of those sustainability mindsets, that big graphic, the spiral. It goes into a huge amount of detail on like what's behind that. That really pulls together all sorts of research from place-based education to the next generation science standards to global citizenship education, really pulling those themes together. And I ended up back at the Smithsonian doing this work, which, you know, I love and drives me every day.
It's so evident in the guide and the work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious too about your colleagues at the Smithsonian and the collaborators that you work with beyond the Smithsonian to develop these guides. What do they bring, and how do you make sure when you look at all of your identity maps that you have a representative perspective?
That is a great question, and it's one we spend a lot of time thinking about. So thank you for asking it. And I think it's so important, because if we're going to share sort of ideas and opinions and perspectives with young people, I think it's really important that they see themselves, that they see connections, both in terms of, you know, their future as STEM professionals, to be able to see, you know, what that might look like, but also even just if they'll never become STEM professionals, to see that the sustainability conversation, the conversation about how to create the world we want, is a conversation that needs to include everyone. So the Smithsonian, we're super lucky in that we sit at this sort of nexus of scientific research and discovery through many of our really fantastic research centers and the zoo, which does actually an amazing amount of research. And then also like history and culture through a lot of our museum colleagues. So it's really wonderful to be able to draw on those resources. We also have the resources of the Inter-Academy Partnership, which has National Academies of Science for all over the world. So, so we try and use those avenues to make sure that we're getting scientists not only from a diverse cross-section of the United States, but also around the globe, because these guides are meant for a global audience, not just an audience within the United States. So for instance, in this guide, we have people from the Philippines. I've got someone from Mexico. I have someone from Mongolia. We have some voices from Canada, some Indigenous researchers, some members of the Black community. So just trying to make sure that we're really representing the conversation in a holistic way. And I think that that's really important, because environmental justice is framed differently in different spaces, and that's fine. But trying to make sure that those various opinions and approaches are represented so students can see it. And that's true in this guide, and it's true in all of our guides. We really work hard to make sure that we have a diverse set of experts and activists.
It's so interesting to think about that global landscape of defining environmental justice, because we're so focused right now on defining what environmental justice looks like in Maine, and that's appropriate, right? It's our local community, but it's so much more complex when you get when you widen that lens. I'm curious about how all of this good thinking and all of these rich conversations that are absolutely going to flow from this guide will filter back to those conversations in the Maine State House, in the US Congress, at the UN. How can we make sure that those brilliant insights that young people are bound to have get filtered to the decision makers and policymakers?
It's a great question, and I might throw it back to you in just a second. But I think that it comes in with that systems thinking piece, that young people are not just seeing the causes that are sort of the hyper local causes, but they're starting to see that the systems. So, what are the things that need to happen in order to, mitigate the effects of climate change? Or what are the things that need to happen to make air pollution around the United States, less or more just? How does government, how does policy have a role to play in that? And I think it's so important, especially when you're talking about something like environmental justice, which, let's face it, one individual young person probably cannot solve on their own, but they can become a really important voice for change. So starting to, tell their peers, starting to tell their parents, and also starting to use their influence. So really starting to think about who can we affect. One of the activities is in the guide is young people stop and think about the roles of sort of different groups in either promoting environmental justice or, causing environmental injustices. And that's everything from, their peers to their school, to their local government, to, all the way national government and UN. And I think it's really important that they see that, businesses, everybody has the capacity to help or to hurt, and that those choices are really important and that they can influence those choices.
What a powerful lesson for all of us to reflect on every single day. That's true. It is really fun to get a sneak peek at a community guide that hasn't even been released yet. So we know that that's true, and we won't ask how students and teachers are using it around the world yet, because we know that is impossible. But can you tell us a little bit about one of the guides that's maybe been out for a little bit longer and has a little bit of a track record. How are people using it, and how do you get feedback? I hope so.
We do. And some of our, this is actually one of our shorter guides. Some of our longer guides, we have a chance to do even more of a field test, which is really exciting. I'll talk a little bit about our sort of most recently released guide before this, which is Sustainable Communities. And that has been just fascinating to see how it resonates with people. One of the activities sort of early on in the guide is young people kind of envision what a sustainable community would look like. What would their perfect community be? What would be a part of it? And I had a teacher recently email me a bunch of kids in the schoolyard, and they had decided to collaboratively create their perfect community basically in the sand pit of the schoolyard. So they had built different things and they had moved around, and there were leaves marking different areas. And I love that, because it had never occurred to me that that was a thing that could be done, but it really shows the creativity of young people and sort of evolving it to fit their own needs in their own space. We recently, sort of this fall, we've been participating in a program with sponsored by the US Embassy in Paris. And we had classrooms in the United States and classrooms in France. And together in a virtual collaboration, they were doing the Sustainable Communities Guide, some activities from it. So that was fantastic. They all did their identity maps, and I mean, it was one of those like, they're so amazing. They would come out beautiful drawings. Sometimes they used objects. But we also asked them to explore things like there were some possibilities to do a personal sustainability investigation where they really thought about, their transportation for a week, or their use of water at home for a week, or some of these sort of micro actions. And then they came back and shared it. And they were so inspiring to then come back. And they came back and they said, okay, well, now I've decided for the next week, I'm going to make this change. And they shared it with their peers to create some accountability and came back and reflected. So it's been really wonderful to see young people sort of engage with this and take it on to sort of interrogate their own systems and figure out what they can personally do, sort of in their own behavior, but then also how they can start to sort of affect larger things.
I really do want to get these guides in the hands of every kid in Maine, every teacher in Maine, and well beyond. I do know, though, that we're in a contentious moment in our cultural existence and society around science, and that feels wild to say and to acknowledge. But is there ever any pushback, or is there ever any, just what comes up for kids and perhaps for families who are more skeptical? I'm thinking of your vaccine one, perhaps.
Yeah, and this was definitely something we had to consider when we were thinking about vaccines, because unfortunately, it is a contentious issue. And so when we were thinking about that, we thought, rather than coming from a place of judgment, as in like, you need to do this thing, I think we need to come from a place of sort of exploration and understanding. So at the Vaccines Guide, I think I mentioned earlier, they create a community concerns list. So they start off by really thinking, what are people worried about? And some of those concerns are valid at certain points, like they're worried about their community, they're worried about their own health, they're worried about their kids. So starting to say, people aren't, bad, they maybe lack knowledge, or maybe they lack, understanding. And so starting by creating the community concerns list and then really digging into the science. How do vaccines work? How does a clinical trial work? What happens? How do we know things are safe, or how do we try and prove things are safe? One of the activities that I love from the Vaccines Guide is young people think about like, well, think about like a lotion you would use, or food you would eat, or something that goes on or in your body. what would make you trust it? Would you trust it if, you know, your religious leader told you to trust it? Would you trust it if, you know, they had tested it on 40,000 people? Would you trust it if your doctor told you? Would you trust it if the TikTok person you follow told you? You know, like, what makes you trust things? And once again, not from a place of judgment, but from a place of, you know, sort of self-reflection, and then bringing that to others. Like, if I'm trying to influence my community, what are the trusted avenues for my community? How can I use those trusted avenues to try and share information with others? So absolutely. I mean, these are sort of by design at this like very, you know, difficult space. If these problems were easy to solve, we would have solved them a long time ago. These are the tricky problems, what sometimes people call the wicked problems. So trying to help people come at it from a lens of, you know, informed action, not just do this thing, but why are we doing it? Well, we're going to use social scientific research to understand our community and what they're thinking, and we're going to use science to understand the science behind it. And then we are also open to other things, alternative ways of knowing and thinking. I think it's really important to be open, but to make choices based on like real information.
You know, when we did that identity map at the beginning, I shared that I had a part of my identity is as a former elementary school teacher. And I know from my experience, and I'm hearing and what you're saying, just the potential that opens up when you have these really difficult conversations with kids. It's often easier to bring them up with students than it is with adults, but boy, are they the same questions and the same set of conversations that we need to be having. So thank you. Thank you for sharing this guide and the whole Smithsonian Science for Global Goals project. I have a feeling you're going to see a bit of a bump in activity on that website right after this, because we are just so grateful. I'm sure all of us want to learn more. Thank you, Heidi, for being with us today. Thank you, everyone who joined. We will share that follow-up email this afternoon with the recording and those links. And we'll be back in this space next week to learn about proposed plans to develop the Port of Searsport for offshore wind. In March of 2020, Governor Mills requested that the Maine Department of Transportation do a feasibility assessment at the Port of Searsport, which includes Sears Island and Mack Point, to explore what we need in terms of marine infrastructure requirements to support the construction of floating offshore wind turbines. Heidi, we could use a community resource guide to help us explore this one, but we'll start next week with Matt Burns from the Department of Transportation to walk us through that feasibility assessment, tell us how the public can engage with this process and where we go from here. I hope to see you all next week. Grateful to all of you for joining. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
A pleasure being with you all.